Welcome back to the Unseen Wisdom, where we dig into the news to find the insights you might have missed. Before we get started, like, comment, subscribe for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics. Okay, so today we're diving headfirst into Jacob Zuma's corruption trial in South Africa. His legal team is making a pretty bold move right now.
Really?
Yeah, they're trying to appeal a judge's decision about advocate Billy Downer. The judge said Downer can stay on as the prosecutor, but Zuma's team wants him off the case.
I see. That's definitely a big deal. It's a pretty high-stakes legal battle for sure. And what makes it so interesting is that each side, is making some really thought-provoking arguments. It's like they're both raising some really valid points.
Yeah, it's fascinating how both sides are approaching this. Okay, so let's get down to, the nuts and bolts of this appeal. Zuma's lawyers are saying that Downer, just by being involved in the investigation,
right,
it creates a conflict of interest.
Uh-huh.
They're saying it raises serious questions about whether Downer can actually be impartial.
Yeah.
And they're going so far as to, frame this as a classic David versus Goliath situation.
Yeah.
They're really trying to highlight the power dynamics involved here.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, it's a really clever tactic, trying to draw attention to their argument.
Yeah.
By bringing up, this classic underdog story. They're really trying to tap into that, that feeling of fairness that we all have. It's like they want people to ask, can Zuma really get a fair trial with all this going on?
And, they're not holding back on the strong language either. Zuma's lawyer actually called it madness to even think about going forward with the trial with Downer as the prosecutor.
Oh, wow.
They're worried that, a later ruling, to remove Downer could just throw everything out the window. All that time and money and effort just wasted.
Yeah, I can see their point. That madness quote, that's a pretty calculated move, It's like they want to emphasize how crazy the whole situation is. And it's not just, legal arguments they're making. It's like they're trying to make everyone feel uneasy, like, hey, this doesn't feel right, does it?
It definitely adds another dimension to the whole thing.
And you know what else is interesting? They're really smart about how they're framing this appeal legally. They're actually saying it's a civil matter, not criminal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they're claiming it falls under the Superior Courts Act, which, guarantees a right to appeal. So it's not as straightforward as it might seem at first glance. It's getting pretty complicated.
Yeah, so it's not just a simple question of bias or no bias. There are all these layers of legal procedure and interpretation involved.
Exactly. Zuma's lawyer also claims that Judge Chile, the one who originally said no to the recusal, well, he missed some really important legal points.
Like what?
Well, they say he didn't properly address the whole issue of prosecutorial bias.
I see.
They keep bringing up this case, the Glenister case.
Yeah.
And it's a really important case in South Africa, dealing with the separation of powers. Like, how much power should investigators have and how much power should prosecutors have?
Okay.
Keeping them separate is really important for fairness.
Right, to make sure one side isn't influencing the other too much.
Exactly. So by bringing up the Glenister case, Zuma's lawyers are trying to make a bigger point.
Okay.
It's like they're saying, hey, this isn't just about Downer, it's about the whole system and whether it's really set up to be fair.
That's a pretty big claim. So they're basically saying Downer's actions, if they are biased, could actually threaten the fairness of the entire justice system.
That's the argument they're making. It's a bold strategy for sure. And to really hammer home their point, they're going way back into legal history, like digging up cases from 1948 and 1972.
Wow, that's going pretty far back.
I know, right? But it's pretty smart. These cases, they dealt with prosecutors who were too involved in the investigations. And the courts back then, they ruled against those prosecutors. So Zuma's team is using these old cases to say, look, this isn't some newfangled idea. The courts have been worried about this for decades.
So they're trying to show that their concerns about Downer aren't just, random complaints, but they're based on solid legal precedent.
Exactly. And it all boils down to this idea of detachment. A good prosecutor, they argue, needs to be able to step back and look at the evidence objectively. They can't be too close to the investigation, or they might lose their impartiality.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like if you're too emotionally invested in the case, you might miss important details or interpret things in a way that favors your side, even if you don't mean to.
Right. And that's what they're accusing Downer of, essentially. They're saying he's too close to the case, to be fair. Zuma's legal team, it's like they're really covering all their bases here.
Yeah.
It's not just throwing out accusations of bias.
Okay.
They're really going after Judge Chile's ruling, saying he, totally missed some important legal points. And that's why his decision to keep Downer on the case, well, they're saying it just doesn't hold up.
So they're really going point by point, like trying to dismantle his reasoning.
Exactly. It's very methodical, their approach. One of their big arguments is, Judge Chile, he didn't look at the whole picture. Like, he looked at each possible instance of bias, on its own.
Okay.
But he didn't think about, like, what happens when you add them all up.
Right, the cumulative effect of all these different actions.
Exactly. It's like, yeah, maybe one thing on its own doesn't seem so bad.
Right.
But when you put them all together, it starts to look pretty suspicious. They're saying Judge Chile should have considered that.
So it's not just the individual incidents, it's the pattern that they're concerned about.
Right. And then there's this whole thing about the reasonable apprehension of bias test.
Okay, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's a big deal in legal cases. Basically, it means, would a reasonable person looking at all the facts have real concerns about the prosecutor being fair?
So it's not about proving that Downer is actually biased. It's about whether it looks like he could be.
Right. And Zuma's lawyers, they're saying all these things Downer has done, especially the alleged leaks, well, it creates that appearance of bias.
So they're trying to convince the court that, any reasonable person would look at this situation and say, wait a minute, something's not right here.
Exactly. And they're focusing on those leaks because it just seems so shady.
Yeah. Can you remind me what exactly is being alleged here?
So basically, they're saying that Downer, while he was working on the investigation, he was also talking to journalists,
Okay.
sharing information that he maybe shouldn't have.
And that could potentially, taint the whole case.
Right, because it's supposed to be a fair process. And
Yeah.
if Downer was, feeding information to the media, that's not fair to Zuma.
Yeah, I see their point.
And there's actually some specific stuff they're pointing to. Like, they have these transcripts of conversations between Downer and this journalist, Sam Soul.
Oh, wow.
And they're saying in these conversations, Downer was, like, coaching Soul on what to write about the case.
Seriously?
Yeah, like even telling him what words to use. That's pretty messed up if it's true.
Yeah, that definitely raises some red flags. Like, it makes you wonder, what was Downer's motivation here? Was he trying to influence public opinion against Zuma even before the trial?
Right, and that's the whole problem with the appearance of bias. Even if Downer didn't actually do anything wrong, legally, this whole thing makes it look like he might have had a personal stake in seeing Zuma get convicted.
And that just undermines the whole idea of a fair trial.
Exactly. Zuma's lawyer really hit on that point during the hearing. He asked, in which universe can Mr. Zuma sit as an accused person being prosecuted by somebody like this?
Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement. It really gets to the heart of the issue.
Yeah, it's like they're saying this isn't just some legal technicality. This is about a man's fundamental rights. It's about fairness and justice.
It's about whether the system is really working the way it's supposed to.
Right. But, the state isn't just going to sit there and take this.
Right, they're pushing back hard.
Oh, yeah. They're saying Zuma's team is twisting the facts and the law to fit their story.
So basically, they're accusing them of making stuff up.
Yeah, pretty much. They're saying Zuma doesn't have the right to appeal right now and that letting him do it would set a really bad precedent.
But if they don't let him appeal, wouldn't that be like silencing his concerns about a fair trial?
Well, that's what the state's trying to argue against. They're saying this isn't about fairness, it's about delay tactics.
So they're basically saying Zuma's just trying to stall the trial.
Exactly. They even use this term, Stalingrad.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It's like a military tactic, just keep fighting and fighting, even if you're losing, just to wear down the enemy.
So they're saying Zuma's doing the same thing in court, just filing motion after motion to drag out the process.
Yeah, that's their argument. But it's a tough one, because how do you really know what someone's intentions are?
Right, it's their word against his.
And it's up to the judge to figure out who's telling the truth.
And the state's also saying that all these issues Zuma's team is bringing up, they've already been decided.
Yeah, they're pointing to previous judgments saying, look, the courts have already looked at this and they said there's no problem.
So it's like a legal been there, done that kind of thing.
Exactly. But Zuma's lawyers, they're not buying it. They're saying, no, this is different. There are new things to consider.
So it comes down to how you interpret the law and the facts. Zuma's team sees it one way, the state sees it another way. And it's up to the judge to decide who's right.
Right, and that's what makes this case so fascinating. It's not just about, who did what.
Right.
It's about these really fundamental questions of law and justice.
And also about, the whole context of South Africa right now.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, Jacob Zuma, he's a very controversial figure.
You can say that again.
This trial, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening against this backdrop of all this political tension. And, people have really strong feelings about him.
So how does that, play into the legal battle?
Well, it makes everything way more complicated. I mean, can Zuma really get a fair trial when so many people have already made up their minds about him?
That's a good question.
And it puts a lot of pressure on the judge.
Yeah.
I mean, no matter what they decide, someone's going to be unhappy. And it could even, lead to more unrest in the country.
It's a lot to handle.
Yeah, this case, it's about more than just Zuma. It's about the whole state of South Africa, their democracy, their justice system.
It's about whether they can really move forward and heal from all the problems of the past.
It's a big moment for them.
It's really interesting how the state's pushing back on this.
Yep.
They're saying, hold on, prosecutors and judges, they're not the same thing.
Right.
They're saying the rules about, being impartial, they're different for each role.
Yeah, that's a key point. It's like, judges, they're supposed to be totally neutral.
Yeah.
Referees in a game, just making sure everyone's playing fair.
Yeah, I get that.
But prosecutors, they're different. I mean, their job is to, build a case against the defendant. They're advocating for the state.
So is the state basically saying that it's okay for a prosecutor to be a little bit biased, as long as they're not, breaking any rules?
It's not so much about saying bias is okay. It's more like recognizing that prosecutors, they have a different role to play. They're not supposed to be completely neutral. Their job is to present the state's case as strongly as possible. So there's always going to be, a little bit of that advocate spirit in there.
Okay, I see what you mean. So they're saying the system is set up to account for that. The judge is there to make sure things stay fair, even if the prosecutor isn't, completely unbiased.
Exactly. The judge is the ultimate safeguard. They have to keep an eye on the prosecutor, make sure they're not overstepping any boundaries.
It's a lot of responsibility for the judge, to be, constantly watching for any hint of bias from the prosecutor and still making sure the whole trial stays balanced.
Oh, for sure. It's a tough job. But that's why we need good judges, people who can handle that kind of pressure and make sure justice is done.
Absolutely. Now, what about those historical cases that Zuma's lawyers brought up?
Yeah.
The ones where the courts, they ruled against prosecutors who were too involved in the investigation. The state doesn't seem too worried about those.
Well, they're basically saying those cases were different.
Okay.
The circumstances were different and the legal issues involved, they don't really apply to Zuma's case. It's they're trying to draw a distinction.
So it's a classic legal debate, right? Each side trying to twist the precedents to fit their argument.
Exactly. They're both cherry-picking cases that support their side, and the judge has to sort it all out and decide, okay, which cases are actually relevant here?
Speaking of things that are relevant, what about that claim that Downer could actually be a witness in the trial?
Yes, the document leak issue.
Right. That seems like a pretty big conflict of interest.
Yeah.
How is the state dealing with that?
They're straight up denying it.
Really?
Yeah, they're saying Downer won't be a witness for the prosecution, and if Zuma tries to call him as a witness, it won't be allowed.
But if these leaks are such a big deal, wouldn't it make sense for Downer to testify?
Well, that's what Zuma's lawyers are arguing.
Right.
But the state's position is these allegations have already been looked at. They're saying there was a previous ruling from the Supreme Court of Appeal that basically said this whole thing about the leaks, it's a waste of time.
So the state is saying, we've already dealt with this, move on.
Exactly. But, even if the judge agrees with the state, this whole thing, it just casts a shadow over the trial.
Yeah, even if Downer is allowed to stay on as prosecutor, there's still going to be that lingering suspicion.
Right. It raises questions about whether people will trust the outcome, regardless of what the verdict is. And that's a problem. Because public trust in the justice system, that's essential for a functioning democracy.
This whole appeal, it's not just about the legal arguments. It's about perception, about whether people believe the process is fair.
You've got it. It's about the narrative and how each side is trying to shape that narrative to win over the public. Because in the end, it's not just about what happens in the courtroom. It's about what people believe happened.
It's been a really interesting journey exploring this case. We've gone through the legal arguments, the potential biases, the whole history of prosecutorial conduct in South Africa.
And we've seen how this one case, it touches on so many bigger issues, like the balance between individual rights and the need to prosecute crime effectively, the role of the media in shaping public opinion about legal cases.
And the importance of public trust in the justice system. It's a lot to think about.
It is, and that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating, right? We start with one specific story, but it leads us to all these bigger questions about society, about how we want to live together. It's not just about Jacob Zuma, it's about all of us.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on The Unseen Wisdom. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the news. Until next time.